Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, welcome. It's Aaron here from the County of Prince Edward Public Library. In just a moment, we will be presenting Maude Barlow in conversation with Jane Lesslie. Maude joins us thanks to financial assistance from the Canada Council for the Arts through the Writers' Union of Canada. So if you do have questions for Maude, there is a chat function in the sort of bottom center of your screen. And you can go ahead and just enter your question there. If you're having technical difficulties, just raise your hand on Zoom. That function is also towards the bottom, and I'll try to give you a hand. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Jane and Maude.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Aaron. So Aaron, you have thanked the Canada Council and the Writers Union, and I, of course, would also like to thank the Prince Edward County Library for this chance to have a sit down, even if it is virtual, with Maude Barlow today. Maude, you're in Ottawa, and actually it's warmer there than it is here in the county. We're both areas are benefiting from lovely weather. Maude's book is still hopeful, Lessons from a Lifetime of Activism. And I found myself thinking when I was asked to do this, that this book really comes at the right time. I was disturbed to read recently about the fall in empathy that we've seen among Canadians after COVID. It was sad to read that a climate activist set himself on fire on Earth Day, which is sort of the other end of the spectrum on a lack of hope. And I feel worried when I read that young people are losing faith in democracy and their hopelessness about climate change, which I gather, Maude, was something that sparked the idea for your book. So your book traces your 40-year social justice journey, and from women's rights to global trade, the global water crisis, and climate change. So you really have literally covered the spectrum and covered the globe. So with that, you were going to take a few minutes for a reading from your book. I have some questions for you, and I'm guessing other people here in the county may join me in that. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you, Jane. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, all of you, for being here, inviting me to be part of this wonderful place. I love your county. I come to you from Ottawa, the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And I just want to say a big shout out to my sister, Patricia Feasy, who's online, I know, from Belleville, and will be embarrassed that I did that, but hi, Patty. So I was going to talk a wee bit about what made me write this book. I've been thinking about hope for a long time, because if you're an activist for a long time, which I have been, I think it's like getting on 50 years now, you have to have some kind of hope. You have to have an attitude that the glass is half full rather than half empty, or you will burn out. And so I've been thinking about it and doing a lot of writing on it, but it really started to come to me when I looked at the world through the eyes of my 4 teenage grandkids, who are, like all young people, like all of us, hearing all the stories about the climate crisis, 10 years left of a good planet, the dying oceans, the 6th great extinction. I can't imagine being 16 years old and being told that's your future. I think it's really tough for a lot of young people. And I watched it through their eyes and the eyes of a lot of young people I work with, really, because they're getting this information. It's not like it's being withheld from them. Their teachers are giving it to them. If they're in a house where it's talked about, they're getting it, and it's all over the internet, right? And so I was planning to do something, and then COVID came along. And I thought, this is the time, if ever we collectively needed a way of finding hope, this is the moment. And basically, here's the main message that I've wanted to give in this book, and then I'll do a short reading in a minute. The main message is that, excuse me, if you feel this hopelessness, and all of us sometimes do, you can then think perhaps the situation itself is hopeless, and it's not. And that's the most important message that I want to give to people, that you may be hearing about a lot of these issues now, maybe for the first time, or maybe you're young and you're just learning about them. But there's lots being done out there. And you have to have some faith that what you do matters, even if it feels small to you. And what others are doing matters too, and that collectively you are making something better. my definition of hope, and it came kind of near when I ended the book, I thought it just kind of took the whole book for me to get there, is that hope is a commitment to protect all that is good for the planet and future generations, knowing you can't control the outcome. And that's very hard for a type A like me. Like I want this done now, and I want, we have to have a plan. But knowing you can't control the outcome, and doing something anyway, putting your hand out to mend the part of the universe you can touch, and having faith that others are doing the same thing. And this is really an important concept. 3 themes kind of came together, or 3 major lessons. One is to define hope properly. And I use a term by an American spiritual leader. She does work with men on death row, so you can imagine her need for hope. Her name is Joan Halifax, and she uses a term, wise hope. And she says wise hope is different than kind of plain optimism. Everything's fine. Well, in fact, optimism and pessimism have a lot in common because you don't have to do anything, right? Wise hope says, yes, you do. You have to look the issue in the eye. You have to know all the facts. You don't sugarcoat it. You need to know what you're dealing with. But then you say, and you allow yourself to grieve if you need to grieve, as Greta Thunberg did when she first learned about the climate crisis. She grieved for 2 years. She was a little girl. She was 11 years old and sat home in a depression. And then she got up one day, went down to the Parliament building in Stockholm, Sweden, where she lives. And she sat there for years, every day, instead of going to school. And she just started this movement. And she said the moment she did that, the depression lifted. So grieving and understanding is one thing, but not going to despair. This is really important. And I quote another wonderful author who says, I feel despair, but I try not to let it come to me. I love it. She says, I don't set a place for it at my table, which I think is quite lovely. So understanding the need for that. And then taking a step and saying, when you're feeling overwhelmed, what is the next appropriate step to take? And you take it. That's the first lesson. The second lesson is basically that out of crisis comes change. And right now we're going through several incredible crises. The COVID crisis and what it has spotlighted, the inequalities, the failure of economic globalization, supply chains and all of that. The war, the horrific war, the assault on Ukraine, of course, which is changing global geopolitics. And the climate crisis. And we know these have come together, and there's an opportunity now because things have been shaken up really deeply. And every time something is shaken up, the old order is shaken up, there's an opportunity for something good, but it's contested, and we know it's contested. And we saw that with Jagmeet Singh being harassed violently in Peterborough yesterday. So there's other ways that people are looking at this. And I look in the Second World War and how what came out of that horrible conflagration was the first human rights framework ever through the UN and then many other ways. And then the third is the need to build a movement. You must be into this for the long run. You can't just say, I'm going to jump in. And there's nothing wrong with saying, I'm going to get involved trying to stop that quarry or protect this forest or, stop a hospital privatization or whatever. But if you really want to make social change, you have to commit for the long run. And so I write about the women's movement and how just a couple of years before Pat and my mother's mother was born, the Elections Act said no idiot, lunatic, woman, or child shall vote. And how much has changed in that 100 years? So, and it can seem like change has come upon us quickly, like a change in weather, where in fact there's been decades and decades, or even hundreds of years of activism. So committing to a movement is incredibly important. And then I go into what's hopeful. And there's so much happening. And particularly, I talk about what I call the tsunami of understanding about the need for biodiversity protection, new treaties coming on methane and coal and plastics, and protecting the ocean floor from deep sea mining, and the commitment, what's called 30 by 30, which is 30% of our land and water to be biodiversity protected. The Canada has pledged to plant 2 billion trees. The tree planting around the world is incredibly important to as a carbon sink, of course, but also to protect soil and to protect water, because watersheds not protected are part of the climate crisis. So really there is a lot going on. And my plea to people is to find out what is going on in your community or provincially or nationally and become part of it and do your part, understanding that your part matters. And then I'm going to do a quick reading here, but I just want to say one more word about the movement part of it. And that is, and I didn't mean to do this coming into the book, but I ended up talking about the need for kindness. I find in our lives, there isn't enough kindness. And by that, I mean conscious kindness, thanking somebody who's doing a job that may not be big and fancy, but boy, it needs to be done, or recognizing what others have done, or just slowing down and taking time with people. I find, and I quote a book in here called On Kindness, where these authors, one's a psychotherapist and others are professional journalists, and they say that kindness in our society, in Western society, is something is for your family, but really it's seen as a sign of weakness because you really got to get ahead and you've got to be competitive. And I found that even in movements, economic justice movements, labor unions, environmental movements, we get competition, we get that kind of lack of kindness. And sometimes it's easier to turn on another fellow activist because you can't change the world, and maybe you go after them instead. And there's a lot of unkindness. And I actually think we need to build into our institutions ways to support each other and to almost institutionalize a form of civility, as I see too many breaking down in too many really important ways. So the two quotes, one is a quote and then the other is a little bit from the afterword that I'll read, because we do readings on these things. One is a wonderful quote from the late, great Carl Sagan. He was an American scientist and environmentalist. If any of you ever used to see his program, he had a wonderful way of speaking. He'd talk about the billions and billions of stars or whatever. He was just, I loved him. But he said this: anything else you are interested in is not going to happen if you cannot breathe the air and drink the water. Don't sit this one out. Do something. You are by accident of fate alive at an absolutely critical moment in the history of our planet. I think that's absolutely gorgeous. So for my reading a little bit from the afterword, I'll just pick a couple of paragraphs here. I start off with another quote. I have many lovely quotes in this book. I took the time to find smart, thoughtful people, many of them poets or writers, and they share what hope means to them. And this is C.S. Lewis, and he said, "You can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending," which I just love. So then I said that the afterword, this book has been a personal journey, for it has reminded me of the possibility of the human spirit to change, and thus for the world to change. I end it with sure knowledge that we will only find our way by remembering what went wrong in the beginning and letting it guide what we need to do now. Many in our modern world have viewed nature as a resource to fuel unlimited growth and to exploit for pleasure, convenience, and profit. This has led to the violence and inequality that such thinking breeds, for now we have to build another system, not in peril. To get ourselves out of this trap, we must listen to the voices calling for us to transform our economies and institutions so that they serve people, promote healthy communities, and reconnect us with the living planet that supports our lives and those of other species with which we share it. And then I talk about the need to really listen and truly listen to Indigenous teachings, that we are not in dominion over the earth and other species. We are, as the Bible, parts of the Bible say, and other parts do not. But we are, in fact, part of nature. And when we hurt nature, we're hurting ourselves. So I end with these several paragraphs. We will have to polish the art of seeing, according to Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's an environmental and forest biology professor at State University in New York College. She's written a wonderful book in 2013. It's called Braiding Sweetgrass: Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the teachings of earth. She says this means listening to plants and heeding the lessons of the natural world. And here's a quote from her. What would it be like, I wondered, to live with that heightened sensitivity to the lives given for ours? Mm-hmm. To consider the tree in the Kleenex, the algae in the toothpaste, the oaks in the floor, the grapes in the wine. I love her language. To follow back the thread of life in everything and pay it respect. Once you start, it's hard to stop, and you begin to find yourself awash in gifts. So then I end by saying, I feel awash in the gift of such visionaries and community of activists here in Canada and around the world. We don't always know what will work and what will not. We get up in the morning and try. When we are at our best, we love and support one another and trust that our actions will make a difference. We embrace the world, and we are kind. E. Ethelbert Miller, a much-loved African-American poet and board chair of the Institute for Policy Studies, gives us this counsel, and I'll end the formal part with these words. He says, place your heart in your hands and blow gently, spread love like seed. Thank you.
That's lovely, Maude. I think that sums it up beautifully. I just wanted to remind people that I have some questions for Maude, but we're really very happy to get questions from the rest of you as well. One that I wanted to discuss, you mentioned the need to have a deep passion, and yet also the need to maintain deep detachment. And that, at first glance, I thought that almost sounded like an oxymoron. And I was going to say, can you explain that? And how do you do that? Because I've been very prone in the past to allowing my passion to burn me out, and just sort of, and then having to retreat. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a bit about those two ideas together.
I struggle with them all the time, Jane, because I'm a type A and I am very much like you. I say, why isn't everybody upset about this? And why aren't we all doing this together? And everybody drop what you're doing and let's get this thing done. It's a Buddhist concept that you have to be deeply attached and deeply committed to the thing that you're doing, the action, the campaign, the issue, the cause, the struggle. But you have to detach from the outcome. It doesn't mean you don't have a plan. Doesn't mean you don't have a goal and a communications process and, things for people to sign and do. Yes, you do. You want this law changed and this is what you're doing, but you can't control it. And if you think you can, then you're thinking too much of yourself. And this is really hard for those of us who are type A's who want to get out there and get it all done. It's not that the outcome doesn't matter, but it isn't the only thing that matters. And you don't know when a win is going to come. And this is really important. I quote Rebecca Solnit, who's a wonderful American public thinker, if you will, on her book, Hope in the Dark. And she says, progress isn't an army moving forward, right? It's a crab scuttling sideways. It's decades or hundreds of years of water shifting, changing a stone. You don't know where it's going to come from. And sometimes you think, we didn't win that, but did we build a better movement? Did we bring young people in? Did we do some new research? Did we find allies in other places? Did we build something better? Because you don't know what's going to win. When I go back in the free trade issues, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement back in the 80s and NAFTA in the 90s, we had the hearts and minds of the majority of Canadians. We didn't win because the vote was split. In the first case, between the Liberals and the NDP took the ante, and so the minority got the deal. And then Chrétien said he would make fundamental changes to NAFTA if he was elected, and he was elected, and he didn't make the changes and signed it anyway. So twice we lost, even though very strong majority of Canadians didn't want it. But we didn't fold our tents. We said, look, we're not against trade. We want it to be done on a basis that is good for people, good for communities, protects environmental health, worker safety, and so on, not just hand it out to corporations to do whatever they want. And gradually we have proven to be right, and we have swung that pendulum back. And I talk in the book about the wins that we've had in a whole host of areas around trade, a huge one called the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, which we won, which was incredible. Basically the defeat of the World Trade Organization's fundamental mandate, and so on. Even the new agreement, North American agreement, Jane, that replaced NAFTA is much better. It's it dropped the right of corporations to sue governments. So that's really good, because Canada was on the receiving end of many of these challenges. We had to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to American corporations. That's gone. There's strong environmental language, strong labor language in the agreement that wasn't in NAFTA. So it didn't happen when I wanted it to happen. It didn't happen the way I wanted it to happen, but it will happen if you're right and you stay with it and you build a movement. And that's the part that's so hard, because it can be very disappointing to lose something that you've worked so hard for and you deeply believe most people want, and polls to prove it, and yet you can't have it. Just take a deep breath, take the time you need to recover, hang out with some nice people, do some fun things, but don't give up. And that's the conundrum kind of solved. Anyway, but it's always, for me, it's always a battle, no question.
No, I understand that only too well. You talked about, I had a bit of an aha moment when you were discussing Vi Morgan and her lesson of finding the quiet mind, which was sort of, to me, it was a bit of a corollary to this, but I just love that. And I wondered if you could talk about that for a second.
Well, Vi Morgan was a woman who lived in Guelph, and she and her husband, Dr. Griffith Morgan, and they were very, very proper. When you would phone and get their answering service, it would say, "You have reached Dr. and Mrs. Vi, Dr. Griffith and Mrs. Vi Morgan." Like very, very proper, right? He was a retired educator, PhD in education, and they fought Walmart. They were going to keep Walmart out of Guelph, and they did for years. And he, in fact, was giving a lecture, or was on a panel around how Walmart was going to hurt small business in Guelph. And he finished his speech and he dropped dead right there in front of young and old. His wife said, Vi said he died with his boots on, right? He gave a speech, and the next day in the Guelph Mercury, it had a picture of Vi and Griff and me, and the mayor saying, "Now heaven save from Walmart," which is very sweet. Anyway, Vi lived a lot longer. She was almost 100 when she died, and I went to visit her just a couple of weeks before she died. And her mind was still so lucid. And I said, "Vi, have you got any advice for me?" And she said, "Do you have a quiet mind?" And I said, "Not really." I'm looking, right? But I'm always, out there. And she said, "You will have a quiet mind when you have faith that others are doing work that you don't even know about.
Right.
Making changes you may never know about in ways that you don't know about, but you have to have faith that something bigger than yourself is there and at work." And it really helped me. And that's part of the letting go of if I don't win this, I'll go home and won't do anything else. No, you probably won't win, or you might, and you might partially win, or you might completely lose this, but you're in for social change. And if you're in for social change, you're in for the long run. And that's part of that really important message about caring for self, caring for others, and trying not to let a disappointment hollow you out, which it can, of course.
Well, it also struck me that was a great illustration of, okay, I need to retreat now. I need to go and hang out with my dog or go into the garden. And the ability to say, this is not just my battle. And there's a whole army out there of other people who I'm not even aware of, who are similarly pursuing this. So I can take a time out to kind of go look after myself and my dog. So.
And Jane, I think people don't. And I think that's part of the problem. And if I could go back now to the organizations that I've been involved with, I'm retired from the big one, the Council of Canadians, but I'm still involved with I would build that in. I would build in time for us to talk about burnout and disappointment and grief and support in a more formal way. I think we could do that in many, 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 many workplaces, especially if you're working on difficult issues, climate change or refugee work, you know, where you or working on human rights in places where the human rights
Yeah.
don't exist, and it can break your heart. You have to build in ways to support and protect. And I would do that more formally. I would advise organizations to do that. But
Think
I
about that.
tell you, I see it in newsrooms. I see it everywhere. This,
Yeah.
you know, people at war with each other who should be working together. And I think there's ways to build in supportive systems that we really need to examine.
And maybe sort of have some understanding that they're coming from that, even, you know, you're all kind of pulling toward a similar goal. And as you said, it's that kindness and saying, well, they're being driven by that as well, and kind of some empathy, coming back to that need for empathy that we mentioned at the outset. So I wanted to ask you, I wanted for a second or two to ask about your background in water security. Here in the county, we've got very vulnerable aquifers, as I was mentioning earlier, very shallow soil. And so water security and droughts are an increasing concern for us. At the same time, it's sort of ironic because we have 800 kilometers of coastline in the county. So while we're worrying about drought and water security, we've also got to worry about rising water levels and flooding. So we get it coming and going in the county. You mentioned and discussed in your book the Blue Communities Initiative, and I'm wondering if you could just talk about that for a moment or two. It sounded like something that went to what you were talking about with local action and what could be taken. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, Blue Communities is more about keeping more about the issue of water as a human right and a public trust than the ecological side. And I'll speak to that in a minute. But we set up Blue Communities when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister. He was saying to municipalities, if you want to upgrade your drinking water and wastewater systems, which they all needed to do, by the way, and that is an environmental issue, you're only going to get federal funding if you go with a private partnership with a private corporation. And we said that is awful. That is you're going to privatize water services. Once you allow for-profit companies in to the delivery of water and wastewater, look, there's a place for the private sector in laying pipes and doing many infrastructure, all that. But the decision around who has access to water and what they pay must be held in public hands. It must be democratically controlled, and it must be transparent. And what happens when it's privatized, it's all about profit. And we know the prices go up. We've seen this in many, many places immediately because they have to take the same amount of money for the service and have a profit for their shareholders. So you don't want that system. So we started Blue Communities as a way of getting municipalities to say, before Harper gave them this decree, we're not doing that. And so a Blue Community promises to protect water as a human right, as a public trust, therefore no privatization, and to phase out bottled water, because we're also deeply concerned about plastics on municipal premises, but also to promote, if you've got good, clean, healthy, safe water coming out of your taps, to promote that in your community. And we have many, many communities and many municipalities in Canada and around the world, actually. There are now 25 million people living in formal Blue Community municipalities. As to taking it a step further, I think the issues around, when you talk about the conundrum of having water and surrounded by water, and yet the water crisis can come upon us. And I wrote about this in a book 3 books ago called Boiling Point, Government Neglect, Corporate Abuse in Canada's Water Crisis. And trust me, we have a water crisis coming. We have what I call in this country the myth of abundance. We think that we have it's in our music, it's in our history, it's in our culture and our painting and our stories. Water, water, Canada. So we love our water. Well, we don't actually. We haven't taken care of it at all. We haven't mapped or protected our groundwater. We have no rules around the nutrient overload from farms, factory farms that are, the blue-green algae, and something like 246 major lakes in this country, including Lake Winnipeg, which gets very sick most summers. We allow many chemicals into our food system and our waters that should not be there. So we have not put our money where our mouth is, saying that we love water in this country because we haven't protected it. We are beginning to. There's some very good signs, though. Back to the theme of hope. But what local communities need to do is to say, we need to get a handle on what our water sources are, how sustainable they are, and then who should have access to them and why. There should be no bottled water plants in Canada. Industry Canada promotes private for-profit corporations from other countries coming to Canada and helping themselves to our water. And when it hasn't been mapped, when we don't have any idea if this is going to run a particular area out, and we've been fighting what was Nestle, it's been sold to a bunch of private investors now, 3 big sites around the Guelph area. And there are many in Quebec, there are many out in BC. I mean, it's a free-for-all and it has to stop. So we have to ask the question, how much water do we have? And we need to set up public watchdogs to say who has access to it and under what circumstance. And I'm telling you, if they're going to hurt the water, or they're going to take too much, or it's for profit and not giving anything back to the community needs to set standards. And I predict, Jane, we will be doing that sooner than later as people start to understand the crisis we're dealing with.
We've got one question here from Adam. Adam, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. You're saying, how pressing would you say is the problem of plastic pollution?
Well, thank you for asking. I expect, Adam, if you asked, you probably know that it's huge. Every minute in our world, 1 million bottles of the single-use plastic water are consumed every single minute. If you were to put those bottles, just the individual single-use bottles, just for water, in 1 year that we use, end to end, they would reach over halfway to the moon. We are polluting our waterways, our lakes, our rivers, our forests, our landfills, and these things take hundreds of years to break down. And it's so awful when you can turn on a tap and get clean, safe water. Yeah. We're so blessed in this country and people don't understand it. And I know that's not everyone. And I know in many, not so many anymore, that's being rectified, but on some Indigenous First Nations communities, it still isn't there. But for most of us, we are able to turn on the tap and get safe, clean water that we've paid for. You're paying in your service charges, you're paying to have that water cleaned and delivered to you. So to say, well, I'm going to go to a store and buy plastic water is crazy. But we really do have to get a handle on this plastics. We knew a couple of years ago it was in our food chain. Now we know it's in us. It's in our bodies, it's in our blood, it's in our brain cells. This is plastic in our brain cells. This is fossil fuels inside of us. And yes, we absolutely have to get a handle on this.
It's interesting. I mentioned that I'm the chair of the Environmental Advisory Committee, and we get questions, what I think of as questions, the throw up your hands questions, because you just don't quite know what to do. I know you have a lot of experience looking at the mining industry in developing countries. And so I've got one member of my committee. So we've talked about, we want to encourage electric vehicles. We want to, the county's moving in that direction with hybrids. People are becoming more aware, and the choice is about to improve remarkably in terms of what's out there in EVs. But he said, well, the downside is all you're doing is you're exporting your environment problems to these countries where they have to mine for the materials to make EVs. So it's sort of like, how do you approach that? How do you think about that? How do you reconcile that? Because I don't quite know what to say to him when he says that to me.
He's right. First of all, there are 2 aspects to this. One is the abuse of these mining companies in the global south, and the way they get 50, 60, 70, sometimes 100-year leases to a huge parcel of water, right? And they own that water. It's another form of water privatization. And they can dump their toxics and their cyanide poison. It's a gold mine. They're going to have cyanide waste, and they own that lake and that river, and they can just do what they want. And they leave a terrible footprint. And of course, it impacts the health of the local people very badly. Canadian mining companies have a horrible reputation in the global south, really. That feeling of, wear a Canadian flag and you'll be proud. Well, not in some countries in Latin America, certainly not in Central America, I can tell you, in Guatemala and many places I've been. So we have tried, different members of parliament have tried to introduce legislation here in Canada, in our parliament, to impact the way Canadian mining companies behave in other countries, and that they have to be establishing the same standards of human rights and environmental protection there that they're required to do here. And it keeps getting thwarted one way and another, but it is very important, because these are the bad ambassadors for Canada. I mean it. There's a lot of places you say, I'm Canadian. It's like, you're one of your Canadian companies just destroyed my town, right? But the other thing is the other question of, do electric cars, is that going to be the answer? And I think that's a very complicated question. Our demand for more energy is a problem no matter where we're going to get it. Fossil fuels, we clearly know, is a problem, but we also know there are issues sometimes with the ability to get enough wind and some of the problems associated there, and solar. Solar panels take a lot of water to build. And then the minerals, the fine minerals that you're talking about that are being mined in other places and or in Canada. There's going to be some in northern Ontario, or at least there's talk of it, and not a Canadian company, by the way. And so it goes to the question of, back to public transport and how we get around. And do we need all these cars? And can we think about different ways of living so that we're not going to change our lives? You know, still want 2 cars, and well, maybe one's enough. And maybe if you live downtown, you don't need a car. Maybe you can walk and take public transit, and, you know, rent a car if you're going to do something on the weekend. Like, maybe we could think of a different way of reducing our energy footprint, because I'll tell you the truth is, I don't think there's an easy solution to the alternatives to fossil fuels. There are many, many solutions. One of them, of course, being retrofit of our buildings, and building new buildings having to be, you know, energy fit and so on. I mean, we know how to do this in so many ways, but in the end, more and more people using more and more energy is a problem. And we need to build cities and livelihoods around different ways of mobility.
Yeah, I guess in a more rural community like ours, the trying to make public transit viable has been a bit of a challenge. We've made some headway here. And certainly we're trying to encourage more gentle density in our, what we call subtle areas, so that people do have an option to be carrying out more activities on foot and like. So we're still stuck
a lot
with
of people moving into the county as well.
We sure do. Yes. And that's, you know, and that creates some social, I mean, it's great, and yet it's problematic in terms of ensuring people can still be housed. Affordable housing is a critical issue. So it's a bit like an opportunity, but it's an opportunity that doesn't come without its issues. So we're trying to encourage that, you know, the density in our new official plan, which we brought in last year. Another throw up the hands question I get is, well, there's no point in doing anything about greenhouse gases, or that I should get an electric vehicle, or I should worry about my greenhouse gases because, you know, there's China's polluting at a far greater rate and India's building new coal plants. And it's like, I think of that as the after you, Alphonse question. You know, it's like, and in the sense of, well, I'm not taking any action until they take action. And I'm just sort of wondering how you think about those questions. And I think you've actually, in your book, you're identifying, well, actually, there are some positive trends in those locations. You can't say this, you know, call me when something's happening there. Yeah. Something is happening there.
Absolutely, Jane. And thank you for that. Yes, I mean, it is a natural human trait to say, okay, what is my little footprint going to do when, you know, so much of the world's goods stuff is made in China, or, you know, Vietnam or India, and places where they are putting their toxics and from the leather making or the dyes or whatever into the waterways. But we have to remember there are people who live there, And they
Yeah.
don't want it. They don't want their waters and their air polluted, and they are demanding changes from their government. And in fact, in China, and I write about this in the book, there has been tremendous change. There has been an agreement to, and a very strong move to cut back on coal because it poisons people's, I've walked the cities of Delhi. You get up in the morning and you go out and you're clean, and you come home in the evening and go like that, and just
Yeah.
black soot is on your, like you are dirty.
Yeah.
People live there. They don't want this. And so there's pressure there from inside to make difference. And I think if we say they'll never do it, or we'll do it when they do it, equally they could say the same thing. We all have to be doing the piece that we can be doing. And that's the part about handing over a little bit of faith in the larger picture. I can't make everything, I can't have it all my way. I can't make it all better all at once. But I will, and that's why I love the concept of I'll put my hand out, amend the part of the universe I can touch. What can I do? And what can I do with others? And what can we do together? And China did agree for the first time at the COP26 in Glasgow last November. And so did India, to join the Paris Agreement. Now, they were talking about net zero limit by 2070, which people say, well, that's ridiculous. But if you've been to India, half of India is still rural people living in, and they burn coal. They dig up coal and they burn coal. You don't turn that around on a dime. And so you have to have some faith that other people are wanting clean air and clean water and good education and healthcare for their kids, and that they're fighting for that themselves. Against big odds often. And it's our corporations, might I add, remind us, acting like they do in places like China, that they get to, move their industry and their manufacturing offshore, where the wages are nothing, or where they can use child labor, or where they can dump their environmental waste. Sometimes we're benefiting when we buy clothing from other places. We're benefiting from cheap clothing because they've gotten away with that kind of thing, and it's made by companies from our country. So it's just not that simple to say over there they're bad and over here we're good. It's all, in an intertwined world like this, it's complicated.
You were talking, I mean, here in the county, I saw some research a couple of years ago that said it's hard to get a lot of, I had a background in studying economic research and data, and boy, trying to get that at the municipal level is a real challenge. But someone put together a report that said 25% of our economy here is from the agricultural community. And so, and in your book, you talked about funding being increased in the federal budget to help the farming industry adapt to climate change and their transition process. And I wonder if you can talk about that a little, and what is some positive research in that area? Or if we were looking for more ideas on, like, who would you look to? Are there universities? Who could help us kind of get in touch with that?
Well, basically it's called regenerative farming, regenerative food production. And it's going back to ways again that we've known for many years, and techniques where we protect soil and we rotate crops, and we care for the land and the animals and the water. And the more we move away from small farms, and I wrote about this much more in the book on Canada's water, really a whole chapter on how we've changed from small family or medium-sized family farms to these great big mega farms, to industrial agriculture, where you don't live on your farm anymore. You live somewhere in a condo in downtown Toronto or whatever, and you pay people to go in and work your fields. And the more we do that, and the fewer corporations that control everything from wheat to meat to dairy to whatever, the less control we have over how our food is grown. And this is part of the problem for water, because then you have the runoff from factory farms. I mean, that's why Lake Winnipeg is sick, because of the hog farms, the factory hog farms. So it's not good for the animals. It's not good for the soil. It's not good for the water. It's not good for the owners. It's a model of farming that we've moved to. And so this is, the federal government has put aside a fair amount of money to support more sustainable farming, not necessarily all organic, although that's a big part of it, and not necessarily just non-meat, although again, moving to a lot of plant-based diets is promoted, but it's just, it's living with the environment, it's living with nature as opposed to conquering nature. It's all part of that same kind of thinking that all of it's here for us. And let's just take it and move it where we want and dump whatever we want into it. And, you know, again, this myth of abundance, we have so much farmland, so much soil, so much water, so many trees. It doesn't matter how many we take down or how much we dump into the, yeah, it does matter actually. And in a community like yours, where the environment is fragile and you don't have big cities, so you see everything, it's really, you know, very, very important that you work together on this. The National Farmers Union, I would send you to their website. They're absolutely wonderful. But there are many groups that are doing very exciting work on regenerative farming and ways that we can support it. And I think lots of people do. We're careful in how we shop and where we shop and what we buy, and supporting local farmers and supporting sustainable food production. As a consumer, you have a large role to play as well.
Yeah. I particularly enjoyed the sections of your book where you discussed your involvement with women's rights, and you talked about some critical women in Canada's past, like Judy LaMarche, who was our second female cabinet minister. You talked about working for Marion Dewar, the former mayor of Ottawa. And you also talked about meeting with former German Chancellor Angela Merkel to discuss issues around the CETA, the Canada-Europe Free Trade Agreement. And you came away feeling heard by her. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about that conversation and sort of what some takeaways were from that.
Well, I like her. I have to say, I love to know what she's thinking right now, which is, she's been so careful and quiet. Like power was handed over to a new administration and she walked away, and she's honoring that. But I miss her personally. I was invited to be, so what happens in Germany is when they have the G7 or the G20 meeting in Germany, there's an agreement that the chancellor will meet with civil society the day before. So I was invited to be one of the international civil society people. So I got to debate and sit with her, and I liked her very much. I gave her a copy of my book, Blue Future, on the future of a water healthy world, and it had been translated into German, and I handed it to her, and she said thank you, and I went to take it back just to hold it so she wouldn't have to worry, but she said that's mine, and I thought I like it. She grew up in East Germany, and the confusion around that, so she would call herself kind of a conservative, but she really isn't. She really does understand the larger social needs. I mean, I can't imagine what it was like to grow up behind that wall, and to see it come down, and then to see it all try to come together and to figure out what that means, and broken promises on all sides. And but she was a strong leader, and I'm personally missing her. I just think she had a place. I know a lot of people say she was the one, but she wasn't the first to depend so heavily on Russian oil and gas, but that started before her. And
that was more Schroeder, I think, before her.
Yeah. And I think, in fairness to all of them, the idea was he won't go to war with us or with, our side.
With his own client. Yeah.
And of course, that's not true. So you can know that's hindsight and very difficult to.
Yeah. Are there some younger women leaders who you feel excited about when you see them, or you keep an eye on as up and coming? Who else can we be looking to that kind of excites you?
Well, and I have to go after this because I've another event, but yes, I mean, I'm impressed with the women in our cabinet, in the current cabinet. The Deputy Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister Jolie, Anand. I think this is a front bench that's very, very strong. Here in my own city, we're going to have a mayoralty race in the fall, and I'm supporting my councillor is going to run, Catherine McKinney. So these are local women you wouldn't necessarily know. But yes, I think there's a number of young women also in the environment movement, in the labor movement. We have a woman, Beatrice, as head of BUSCI. Her name is head of the Canadian Labour Congress, who's tremendous. We have Linda Silas, who's the head of the United Nurses, Canadian Federation of Nurses Associations, who's a real spokeswoman for women, for healthcare. Natalie Mara is a wonderful spokesperson for healthcare here in Ontario. She's with the Ontario Health Coalition. So there are really lots and lots, maybe not so high profile as the kind of the women in cabinet, but I do think there are. I'd like to hear some women in the Conservative Party speaking out against what's happening, because their party has been hijacked by the extreme right.
Yeah.
And that attack on Jagmeet Singh yesterday, and on Trudeau when he was campaigning, and I'm in the red zone in Ottawa. When the occupation was here, we had police everywhere. It was awful. They were awful. These weren't people expressing their legitimate views. These were people flying Nazi flags, screaming at media, screaming at people, throwing people down in the snow if they had a mask on and ripping them. There was one older woman who'd had was coming out of her doctor's office. She'd had a knee surgery. She had a cane. She had a mask on. They threw her down in the snow and grabbed her mask off and threw the cane away and stuff. I mean, this isn't civil language, and yet you get
not civil society.
It's not. There's a new brutal civil discourse that deeply, deeply disturbs me, and I would love to hear some of the women in the Conservative Party speak up about this, because it's going to impact them. There is a proud tradition of red Tories and women in the Conservative Party who stood for women's rights and who stood for social justice and healthcare and so on. And that strain is getting drowned out, and so it would be really wonderful to hear those voices.
Maude, I could easily keep you here for another hour, if not more. Maybe we can have you back at a later occasion, but I want to thank you so much for joining us today. And I came away from your book hopeful, which was terrific. So it performed its magic. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today. I really appreciate it.
My entire pleasure, Jane, and thank you so much. And thank you for all your wonderful work, and hope to meet you soon.
That'd be great. Well, we look forward to having you down here in the county. You've got family in the area, so we expect to see you.
All right, take care now.
Okay, you take care. Bye-bye. Aaron, I guess we can turn that over to you.
Thanks so much, guys. Thanks, Maude and Jane. That was great. Just a reminder, we do have Maude's books at the library. We've got paper books and digital versions as well. And they're also available at Books & Co., our local bookstore. And just a quick plug, next week, Tuesday, May 17th, we're featuring Linwood Barclay, moderated by Vicki Delaney, a local writer. So if you haven't registered for that, go ahead to peclibrary.org and sign up there. Otherwise, thanks again, Maude and Jane, and thanks for coming, everybody, and have a great afternoon.